Hi, my name is Gabriela Cardenas, and I'm a first, second grade teacher in the Learning into Languages program. So for the last couple of days in math, we've really been working a lot in two of the mathematical practices. One being making sense of problems and persevering in solving them, and the second one being how to reason abstractly and quantitatively. So last week, one of our learning goals was to give and receive feedback to develop and deepen our mathematical thinking. So in order to get students to really give each other constructive feedback, we really felt that it was important that we set specific success criteria to help them engage in that kind of feedback. So part of the success criteria was for students to practice on explaining their strategy. So aside from just thinking of a just right strategy to help solve the problem, it was also being able to practice on how to articulate their strategy and the steps taken into solving the problem. So after having a week to practice explaining their strategy in front of a partner, in front of a group of students, and for many students even in front of the class, I thought it was important for us to move into this whole idea of giving feedback, but now with a different lens in mind. This time I wanted students to not only to focus on the content and the strategy, but more on the delivery and the explanation of their strategy. So to do that, I wanted students to really think deeply about their strategy, to really think about the steps they took to solve the problem and the reasons why they not only decided to use that strategy, but also to think why that next step, why join those two numbers together and really explain their reasoning behind that. So I have a couple of work samples where students had an opportunity to practice doing. Now, in practicing again how to explain their strategy, the role then of the person who was then the listener and the person who's also their partner, who's also in charge of delivering or giving the feedback, their role was a little different. I wanted them to look at the evidence and listen to their partner explain their strategy, but through a different lens. I wanted them to shift from the content, from the strategy, and focus more on the language use. I wanted them to really consider and think whether or not they were articulating their understanding, or explaining it properly, if they were using proper transitional words, whether or not they were using causal or conditional connectors. And I really wanted them to just focus on the idea of language while working with their partner. So I have a couple of work samples that I'm going to be looking at. Some is their work, so it's their strategy, plus the writing that really explains their strategy or their mathematical thinking behind their strategy. But aside from just work samples, I also have two videos of students conferencing with each other. So I'm going to be looking at the evidence, not only the evidence here in front of me using the iPads, but also their written work to see whether or not students were then able to explain and justify their reasoning, if they were able to then explain and justify their reasoning, but at the same time being very cautious of whether or not they're using transitional connectors to help them explain their strategy. So the first work sample I have here is from a student, Josue. And I'm going to read the problem out loud to give you the context for which students were working from. And the problem reads, Gael has 340 dinosaur stickers. His mom gives him 226 more stickers. How many stickers does Gael have altogether? So in looking at the strategy that this student used, it's very clear that this student decomposed both the 300 and 226 into hundreds, tens, and ones. Now, when looking at Josue's explanation of the strategy, he begins with the word first. So begins by saying, first I wrote the 340 and 226. I decomposed the 340 and the 226. Then I added the 300 and the 200, and I brought the 40 and the 20 together, and they made 60. Wow. Sorry, in just reading it out loud, I recognize that that is all one sentence. So, I mean, that's really something new. So then the next sentence reads, then I brought the 0 and the 6 together. Then I put 560 together and got 560. Then I brought the 560 and 6 and got 566. So what I'm noticing here in looking at Josue's work is he begins with first knowing, right away, explaining what he did at the beginning in trying to solve this problem. But as he continues to explain his mathematical thinking, I'm noticing that he's using then I and then. So there's quite, if you look at it, he uses the word then so much throughout his explanation that I'm very curious as to, he's trying to tell the sequence. You can see that, but maybe what we do need to make sure that we help Josue with is this, instead of using the word then so repetitively, maybe giving a few more lessons on the causal and conditional connectors. So being that that is his written, explanation of his mathematical thinking in writing, I'd like to see what it sounded like as he was conferencing with his with his partner. Many times what happens is that what students write tends to be very different from what they're able to articulate orally when sharing their work with a partner. So I'm curious to see if it was different. What he has in writing is different from what he was able to then articulate orally in front of his partner. So I'm going to go ahead and play that video and see if there was any difference before I give my feedback or what I think would be a potential next step.
The 340 and 226. I decomposed the 340 and the 226. Then I add the 300 and the 200 and the 206. Then I add the 300 and the 200, and I brought them together. I brought the 40 and the 20. They made together and they made 60. Then I brought the 0 and the 6 and the 6. Then I put the 560 together and got 560. And then I brought the 560 and the 6, and I got 566.
What I'm noticing Josue doing is what some of my students actually do, which is write their explanation and then use the written work to then help them when explaining their strategy orally. So as I'm watching the video, I'm noticing that he's verbatimly just going word for word and just sort of just reading out loud his explanation of his mathematical thinking. So being that our focus was more geared towards the listener and what the listener is able to then pick up, and I'm curious to see what his partner, Sadie, had to say about his explanation of his strategy.
I like how you did your strategy, but when you're doing a problem, I would suggest that after first I, you would say then I instead of I decompose. Then after then I, if you want, you can say next I. or you could say after that I. But maybe it would be easier. It would be organized better if you had used the sentence starters.
Well, I think Sadie really nailed it in really focusing on his whole idea of like sequencing and being able to retell his explanation. But then again, yes, he did a really good job of doing that. But a potential next step, as Sadie mentioned, is to use some of the transitional words that we have gone over in class, such as first I, then I, or next. So I can see where she wants to go with that. And, I can see where the focus being the use of language. I mean, that's the feedback that she is giving Josue. I think at this point, she's right in that being that that would be Josue's next step. But I'm even thinking to go a bit further. And I'm noticing that even with her explanation, although she's articulating and saying what his potential next step should be, maybe even taking it a step further, which she would then have to explain why. Why should that be his next step? Where she would then have to explain the reasons why maybe using transitional words would improve his retelling or sequencing of his strategy. So I think at this point, I can see where both students, not only Josue, who's receiving feedback on his strategy, but I can also see where Sadie could use maybe some more help in using causal or conditional connectors. Really not only saying what he should do, but reasons why and because, and sort of just justifying her reasons why that should be his potential next step. So I noticed that, what I was really hoping for in her having this lens and looking at language, she was able to do and capture. And I can also see where, maybe a few more lessons on causal and conditional connectors or just a review would definitely help both students. But I'm also thinking that what might help Josue is maybe as he's retelling his strategy, it may be his conferencing partner, in this case Sadie, maybe every time he comes across the word then, that maybe she can take Post-its and just put a Post-it down. So every time he mentions or says and then, she can then take a Post-it and physically just put it down and take a Post-it and put it down. Maybe that would help him really not only think about sequence, but what other words, what other connectors could he or might he use to retell this strategy, or even reasons why he decided to take that next step. So maybe that would even help him. So maybe as a listener, Sadie can really be pointing out every time he does use and then, and just physically putting a Post-it down. And then maybe together with Josue, after he explains his strategy, maybe going back and thinking, well, what are some potential connectors that could be used along the way? So I think that's what we'll work on in the next couple of days.